Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. Please rise in body and spirit for the reading of scripture. To you who hear me, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. When they slap you on one cheek, turn and give them the other. When they take your coat, let them have your shirt as well. Give to all who beg from you. When someone takes what is yours, don't demand it back. Do to others what you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit does that do you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good only to those who do good to you, what credit does that do to you? Even sinners do as much. If you lend to those who expect to repay you, what credit does that do to you? Even sinners lend to other sinners expecting to be repaid in full. Love your enemies and do good to them. Lend without expecting repayment, and your reward will be great. You'll rightly be called children of the Most High, since God is good even to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be compassionate as your loving God is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Pardon, and you'll be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you. A full measure, packed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. For the amount you measure out is the amount you'll be given back. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. You may be seated. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Kahari Brown to come forward to introduce our guest speaker. While Kahari comes forward, I want to say thanks to him and to, you can come on up. Thanks to him and to Karen Tyler Ruiz and Helen Monroe and Inez Torbert for helping to plan our Black History Month celebration. Please give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, church. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. David Goldberg, our guest speaker for our final Black History Month worship service. Dr. Goldberg is an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State, where he teaches classes and does research on the ways in which the Black working class involves itself in labor and civil rights struggles. In this capacity as an instructor and an administrator, Dr. Goldberg founded and oversees the Crockett Lumumba Scholars Program at Wayne State. This is a 4-year program for African American Studies students with an interest in social justice. Named after African American activists with ties to Detroit, this program emphasizes community building, mentorship, and commitment to academic excellence and social action. To quote General Baker, whose picture has hanged in our lobby, this program seeks to turn thinkers into fighters and fighters into thinkers. Dr. Goldberg seamlessly connects his teaching with his research interest, as he's written and spoken extensively about the Black radical worker tradition in Detroit, with a particular emphasis on General Baker. In a 2014 Jacobin article, Goldberg adroitly drew connections between Baker's labor activism, his civil rights activism, and his critique of racial capitalism. In 2020, he appeared on C-SPAN to discuss the role that Black radical workers played in Detroit's civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, with a particular interest in the role that Baker played. He's currently working on a political biography of General Baker, which draws upon Goldberg's previous writings and lectures. This work will very likely promise to be a seminal piece on the sacrifices that Black radical workers made in Detroit to expand civil and labor rights for workers and residents more broadly. With that, please welcome Dr. David Goldberg to the lectern.
sir. Thank you. Oh, before I start, you turn this on.
Yep, you're good. You're good to go.
Excuse me one moment while I open this. How's everybody today? Thank you for inviting me here. I appreciate it. The choir's fantastic. I appreciate the work you do. I've been giving talks, so please give it up for the choir. I've been giving talks this past week to raise money for the organization that Kahari was telling you about, Crockett Lumumba Scholars. All the money that we raise goes directly to the kids, and one of the things we try and do at the end of the program is teach them, obviously, and mentor them throughout the process of their higher education, but also give them the opportunity to go on a study abroad experience somewhere in the African diaspora, be it Ghana, South Africa, Bahia, Brazil, or the Caribbean, Jamaica or Trinidad. We're still trying to figure that one out. So in the meantime, I've been giving talks to corporate bodies, and I go into those corporate bodies oftentimes trying to identify people that I could tell are starting off quite hostile to what I'm saying, and I just talk to them for an hour and try and see if I can get them to leave the building. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. What can I say? But what I'm trying to do when I talk to these people is have discussions about some of their preconceptions about Black history, about civil rights, right? And I try and complicate the way that they think about it. And I'm so excited to be here tonight, or today, because I'm familiar with this church. And I know that I don't have to talk about how Martin Luther King didn't say he didn't support affirmative action here. I know you all know better. I don't have to do any talk about Shelby Steele or anything like that. So I feel at home. And it gives me a chance to kind of talk about things in greater detail. So I'm very happy to be here. Let me thank the wonderful people that helped make this possible. The committee, Black History Month committee. I want to give you a round of applause. Kari, my colleague at Wayne State University, for reaching out to me, and I have to mention Reverend Rowe for allowing me to be here today. There was some initial consternation about if somebody was going to talk about Black workers that didn't know anything about General Baker. I hope I've assuaged his fears. You guys will be the judge of that, though, when we get done here today. And as I mentioned, this is a special place for me. I used to attend meetings upstairs with Michigan Welfare Rights, and it was always greeted with warmth and love, unless you buzzed too many times, and then you weren't greeted with so much warmth or love, but it was always a pleasure coming up here. And my neighbor, I wanted to acknowledge her in this church, was a woman named Wendy Hamilton, who was a member here. And Wendy led Swords into Plowshares and was very active in this church, and I loved Wendy. I loved her dearly. I just wish she would have been willing to ask for more help than she was. And so I wanted to honor her here because I know how much this place means to her. I'm obviously also familiar with the great works carried out by this church over the years, and despite the difficult position, people who believe in justice, self-determination, and creating a better world for all find ourselves in this moment in history. It's places like this church that people could look to and to understand that, we have to fight, but that fight is a commitment in your lifetime. It's not a moment. So So I want to give you some of the points that I was talking to other groups about, and I think they're kind of clarifying points. And then I'll get on to talking about my passion, which is the history of Black power, anti-capitalist struggles and anti-colonial struggles in Detroit. General Baker obviously is a huge part of that, but you know, I'm very interested in the entire history of Black radical activism in Detroit. So we'll try and talk a bit about that too. Let me start with a few points that I just wanted to make about Black workers in general. One is that Black workers in this country have the highest rate of unionization out of any other group in the country. When the white working class no longer benefited or needed kind of the benefits of the labor movement to such a degree, they turned into what locally we refer to as Reagan Democrats, right? Macomb County, for example, flipped once people no longer needed unionized jobs, and then all of a sudden turned their ire to Black people who benefited from those same unions and responded politically. And I bring this up because this is kind of the foundations of where we are in this moment. And I just want to point out, I'm 52 years old. My whole life has been immersed in this struggle for injustice, in which those trying to make the world less equal, right, give people less rights, give people less freedom to be themselves and pursue their own interests. My entire lifetime has been an attack against the people who fought for a better world. And we're here today in a very difficult time, and we have to ask the age-old question, and it's the same question General Maureen and Marion had to ask themselves. What is to be done? Right? We're back to that foundational question now, because any pretenses we had before about reform through the system should be complicated in your mind by now. So what I would just say is that, you know, the history of activists here has always been, despite maybe lacking in resources, is to make up for it and fight creativity and intelligence in terms of how people carried forward their struggle. So I just wanted to kind of make that acknowledgement. Now I hope to kind of expand on that as we go. Second point that I wanted to make is that Black history, and all history for that matter, is essentially or effectively labor and working class history in and of itself. The movements that we look at and historicize, the March on Washington, you all know this, but when I go to these corporations, I use this example. The March on Washington was not known as the March on Washington, right? It was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, right? That is, we understand the inherent connection, and Black people always did, between economic justice and social justice. And that was always at the heart of the character of the movement, right? That jobs and justice part has been removed from how America chooses to remember the past. And as such, it hinders our ability to realize that nothing was ever completed, there's nothing to pat ourselves on the back about, and that we need to continue to struggle. Amen. And I'm kind of like, I was moved by what you're saying, and I have to say, I'm petty, and sometimes I lack forgiveness. I'm going to tell you, I'm like, God, I got to come here more. Because I have a real hard time turning the other cheek. You know, and I take all this very personally, but to your point, and I think it was a point that Dr. Martin Luther King made, right? And that was that, you know, you don't focus on the individual, right? You focus on the system. That's right. You don't blame the individual. They're a product of the system. Yes. So you don't fight that individual. You fight the system that makes that behavior possible. Yes. And that is what was at the heart of the movement in Detroit. It was at the heart of all Black revolutionary struggles. And also at the heart of that was a connection to other oppressed peoples. And obviously, we're in dire need of that today. because everybody's under attack. I don't care who you are, white, black, brown, male, female. We're all under attack, and we all have to fight with each other. And if we can't acknowledge that in this moment, we never will. Let me just say a little bit about the nature of civil rights and economic rights. I mentioned we're the same within the black community. I make this point because I think it's important to address something you mentioned before about federal workers. Affirmative action in this country did not develop as a social engineering scheme or as a means to create diversity, right? Affirmative action was a legal remedy for proving cases of racial discrimination and gender discrimination at the workplace, right? That is, oftentimes cities settled and agreed to these contracts because they knew that if they went to court and all the evidence was laid bare, they'd have to pay billions in dollars of back pay for people that they had prohibited from getting jobs, right? So when people tell you that affirmative action is about DEI or social engineering, no, it was about racial discrimination, gender discrimination. Right, so all these kind of things that are floating around in this country now are based on a myth and a lie, a big lie, if you will. Real efforts towards addressing the long impact of racial and structural inequality existed for less than 30 years in this country. We're looking roughly from the early 70s to the very early 90s. And throughout that period, even these remedies, which were of course incomplete, had been fought tooth and nail throughout that process, which hindered their ability to be more effective in society. And I think that's really interesting to note that when you think about the history of affirmative action in this country, just know that for 400 years, it was geared towards white men, right? And people now are upset about the 25 years that black people got some remuneration for the unequal treatment they faced at the workplace. Right, so I got those points down, and I just want to now talk about general and about revolutionary struggle and connections between black workers here and throughout the Third World, what was called then the Third World, now we might call it the Global South. Right, and to understand that these connections were deep, and everyday young people like General, like John Watson, like John Williams, like Luke Tripp, like Baba Charles Simmons, right? We're analyzing these questions many times in advance of many of the people that are stand-ins for leaders, right? If you ask the members of a group that formed Uhuru when they were students at Wayne State, which was the group I mentioned, they were all already studying African independence movements. They were studying revolutionary struggles in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia, right? They weren't waiting for someone like Malcolm X to necessarily tell them what to do. In many ways, they were ahead of them, right? And this is the nature of leadership, right? Grassroots leadership in particular, is that movements are led by people, right? And it's up to leaders to catch up to them and not jump out too far in front of them, or else you risk endangering people, right? So on the ground, in a place like Detroit, it makes perfect sense for young black people to meld kind of Marxism with revolutionary nationalism in a way that was distinctive to Detroit. And what I would argue, and what scholars have argued for years, is that the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and prior to that, the Revolutionary Union movements, and I could mention a few. The biggest were LRUM, and of course Drum at the Dodge main plant, but there were many others. These kind of activities, in terms of the Black Power era, So I'm going to get on Kari here because I could do it, right? Whenever we, in retrospect, right, we like to say civil rights. Civil rights becomes, I think it makes people feel better than if we say black power, right? But I have a lot of people in history that just elide black power and they mention civil rights. And that's not to say that, like, there weren't people that were advocating for civil rights in the black power movement, right? But they're different movements and they're different struggles at different times, right? So I think that's important for us to note. In general, if anything, particularly at the time the League was formed, was what I would call a revolutionary black nationalist, meaning he was somebody that combined elements of both and looked at liberation in a two-stage struggle that, if you think back, makes perfect sense and is deeply influenced by Maoism's rejection of kind of what happened with the Communist Party in Russia in the late 50s, as well as the United States' Communist Party's abandonment of the nation thesis. That is, you had to free black people and end discrimination before you could ever get to the stage where you could then attack capitalism and its global impact through imperialism, right? So people were trying to devise a means based on the concrete situation that they faced to fight. They determined for themselves what needed to be done, and they fought towards it. And I always like to make the distinction between Detroit's Black Power movement and kind of the more well-known groups like the Black Panther Party, right? And this is critical, and I think we all need to consider this as we move forward. The Black Panther Party was a group of people that were also revolutionary nationalists. And like the League, it was split between a leadership that was more steeped in leftist philosophy and a base that was primarily black nationalist in orientation. The major difference between the two is that they diagnosed the problem as being capitalism. They identified the United States as the center of that struggle, right? And they then worked towards eliminating it. Now, how did the Panthers go about this? They organized against the police department, right? Whereas, and you know, fought in their organs about the nature of imperialism and colonialism, but their struggle was to stop the police, and the police are just the arm of the capitalist machine, right? Whereas in Detroit, people understood power a little bit better, right? So they actually focused on the source of racism and of imperialism and capitalism, their workplaces, the auto industry in an industrial economy, right? They had identified where they had power, and ironically, where they had power, they had it because of racial discrimination. Because the white people didn't want to work those jobs in the beginning of the line. They didn't want to do that hard and heavy work, right? And so by being at those very basic starting points of production, they were able to shut down those plants and threaten their profitability. The biggest experience or wildcat that they had was at the Elrum plant, right? This is in January 1969. And the Elrum plant was terribly important because it was the only basically chassis or body gear and axle plant for Chrysler in America. The only other one was in South Africa. And of course, the League knew this, right? This wasn't happenstance. They understood this. And so they attacked them at the very first line of production, right? And that, of course, because they did that, brought a storm of surveillance and hostile activity against them. And I will mention, because Marion's here and she will get very mad at me if I don't mention this, but it was women, it was black women in the Revolutionary Union movements that forced the male leadership of that organization to create a broader based body, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, so they would be prepared to take care of people who were disciplined or arrested for their actions. I saw you and I knew that was coming, so it kind of broke my train of thought, but if I could get back to it. I'm scared of her, don't get me wrong. Not as scared, I'm scared of you, but not as scared as I am of Val, I have to say that. But no, the point that I was making about gear and axle is that the kind of understanding of the political economy. And what I'm suggesting to you today is by having that kind of astute analysis, capitalism had to shift after their attacks on it, right? First of all, there were a series of reforms. You had environmental reforms in some cases based on the work done by Drum and the League. You had workplace safety laws. There was no OSHA before they started shutting down plants, right? That didn't exist. And what they were complaining about was, people working on forklifts that didn't work and would tip over and literally kill people. I remember a statistic, and I'll probably jack this up a little bit, but I think it'll be close to accurate. This is apocryphal, I guess. But in Detroit I Do Mind Dying, which is a seminal book about the League, and at least told from one perspective of the split, you'll see that in the plants of automobile companies, American-owned automobile companies, from the early 60s till 1968, there were more workplace injuries and deaths in the automobile industry than there were of Americans sent to Vietnam. Wow. Right? That's how dangerous these workplaces were. From scoliosis, all the environmental factors, the fact that nobody had a mask or anything like that, nobody cared. And they particularly didn't care because black people had started to enter these industries in tremendous numbers. So at Dodge, Maine, where Drum formed, it was roughly 70% black people on the line. Obviously, most of them in the earlier stages of production. The easier stages of production at the end, finishing and quality control, were predominantly white. But the foremen were all white, and mainly Polish, right? So, when they called it the plantation, right, that wasn't an anomaly. They didn't start that either. Local 600 used to call it a plantation, Ford's plantation, right? And black workers always worked in the most dangerous elements of that. And so when Drum started to come into being and drew so much attention, it didn't just catch the guard of the automobile industry, who, I should add, tried to buy all the members off by offering them car dealerships. I guess Mel Ford took that deal somewhere along the line. But I think, what they understood was very powerful about the Eldon plant is that it was an international business, but because of that, they didn't have another gear and axle plant here. And at that time, they knew they could shut down production and profitability for the whole company. And what I'll say is that capitalism responded in kind, right? They started to dismantle all these pieces. They focused on, I'll use the words that they use, pivoting, right, to kind of having a number of small different places that were more mobile, right, where production was on a smaller scale, and they did this simply so you couldn't shut them down through a strike. They could always pick up and move, and they could avoid the problems they faced here and in South Africa in the late 60s and early 70s. Yeah, they learned from what happened, and they continue to do so. And now we have to learn, right? We have to learn, where is our power, right? How can we hurt them? No offense. I know we should love everybody, but sometimes people need to be hurt to get them to pay attention. You got to excuse me, I'm a Jew in the church, it's... and I'm a non-religious one at that. But no, I think the lesson here is you have to find kind of the nexus of power. And I want to leave, and I think that's the most important part, is we really have to understand our power. And we still have power as workers, right? Withholding your labor, although many people in the Democratic Party don't ever consider this as an option, right? Withholding our labor is one of the biggest kind of things that we could do to jam up this system. Not just boycotts, although I'm not against those, but withholding your labor, understanding your value, right? And refusing to capitulate in advance, which we see so many people doing today. Now, okay, I don't want to go on and on, but I do want to tell you a couple general stories while I'm here. I feel like I have to. I came out here and I saw the pictures and all that. Some of my favorites are, and I want to tie it to kind of this notion of international struggle, right? General and his comrades have been studying Marx and Lenin in the early 60s, right? And trying to devise their own plan. But it really wasn't until they went to Cuba, on a trip to Cuba in 1964, that I think this became concretized to them. And while they were in Cuba, as the general used to say, he got to play baseball with Fidel Castro, and he got to meet Che Guevara. He would say Guevara, but I'm going to say Guevara. But the biggest thrill to him at that time was going down there to catch up with somebody who he had a tremendous amount of respect for, who was a gentleman named Robert F. Williams from Monroe, North Carolina. And Robert F. Williams was the head of the local NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. You all remember Jesse Helms, some of you, right? His father, Klansman, leader, Monroe, was the head of the police there. So this is the type of town that Robert F. Williams was trying to fight against discrimination in. And the Klan mobilized against him because he said, we need fighters. We need a working class chapter. It was different from the national NAACP. And they joined together to defend their community from the Klan, and they formed rifle clubs. And they sat and they said, look, people aren't going to come through our community. We're going to defend ourselves and we're going to defend each other. And I think for people of General's generation, kind of proto-Black Power, young people at that time, the ability to be able to fight back in defense of one's community made far more sense, no offense again, than agape or Martin Luther King's notion of loving your enemy. Right? And they viewed themselves as part of this international movement against capitalism and imperialism that is directly kind of operating in the wake of kind of all these African independence struggles and Caribbean independence struggles. So anyway, Jen goes to Cuba in 1964, and they get to meet Robert F. Williams and his wife, Mabel, and to consult with them and talk to them. And then they asked him, what should we do while we're here? And, well, Rob said, go tell everybody your story. And so they looked around and they said, okay, well, look at your passport. Which are the nations that are banned, right? Let's go talk to these people, right? Because they were identifying friends and enemies. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So they went around and they looked at the list, and it's like, you know, the North Koreans, it's all kind of nations of color, except one nation, tiny nation, Albania, right? And they said, what the hell are these white people complaining about, right? Let's go see what they're talking about. What's their struggle? So they went over and they met the Albanians. And they told them about the plight of the black people in America, and the Albanians looked, they nodded their heads because they understood what was happening, but they also said, gentlemen, we've been fighting imperialism since Julius Caesar. And so they understood that struggle regardless of their religion, race, background, what have you. They had been fighting something similar for a long time. And I'll also mention to you something else about that Cuba trip. And I feel terrible for young people today because we really have to decipher now. We always have. But we're inundated with information now. And you have to decipher between what's real and what's fake. And of course, now it's a lot easier to produce fake news, right? Ironically, the people that use that term oftentimes create it. But that's the kind of projection that we get from some of these people. But so they had seen a plane crash, right, that had come, and before they left, they saw the New York Times had covered it up and said a plane hadn't crashed. And the Cubans took them to it to let them know about how reality was being distorted right in front of your eyes, so you didn't know what was happening, right? So we have kind of a mission of truth to bring and connections to make, between our struggles and other struggles, and we have an opportunity now to really carry this work forward. I mean, people talk about finding the positives and the negatives. Well, I'll give you the negatives. The people where I work right now are fearful of losing their jobs and are taking their vacation days because they think the university is going to fire them within the 14 days that Trump gave them. But, of course, as we know, the opportunity that we have there is that the contradictions have never been more clear in this society, right? People are alarmed. Even people on the right know the Constitution, whether they believe it or not. They know that these things are being violated, and it opens up a potential to kind of, for us to do something. But you can't kind of get anything done unless you do two things, of course, and that is to organize and to fight. And that will be a beautiful struggle, and that is one I will be happy to join you in. And if I could, I know I've gone way too long, but that's my nature. I just want to read this to you all because I think it kind of exemplifies the moment and shows kind of where our priorities should be as we look to try and figure out what we could do from here. So this is Jen's letter to the draft board, which I know some of you are familiar with, but I think it brings together kind of the title of this talk. Truth crushed to the earth shall rise again. Right? That's a famous saying that comes out of a Christian experience, right? It comes from pastors. I think Jen knew that both from the pastors that he was raised with and the kind of church community that he was raised with, but Robert F. Williams used to say this all the time. So Jen used to say this all the time. Truth crushed to the earth shall rise again. It's our duty to bring truth to light in this moment. So anyway, let me just do this if I can. Gentlemen, this letter is in regards to a notice sent to me, General Gordon Baker Jr., requesting my appearance before an examining station to determine my fitness for military service. How could you have the nerve, knowing that I am a black man, living under the scope and influence of America's racist, decadent society? You did not ask me if I had any morals, principles, or basic human values by which to live. Yet you ask if I'm qualified? Qualified for what, might I ask? What does being qualified mean? Qualified to serve in the U.S. Army? To be further brainwashed into the insidious notion of, quote-unquote, defending freedom? You stand before me with the dried blood of Patrice Lumumba in your hands. The blood of defenseless Panamanian students shot down by U.S. Marines. The blood of my black brothers in Angola and South Africa, whom are being tortured by the Portuguese and South African whites. Need I say more there? Whom you resolutely support. Respectively, the dead people of Japan, Korea, and now Vietnam. In Asia, the blood of Medgar Evers. 6 Birmingham babies. The blood of 1 million Algerians slaughtered by the French, whom you supported. The fresh blood of 10,000 Congolese patriots dead from your ruthless rape and plunder of the Congo. The blood of defenseless women and children burned in villages from napalm jelly bombs. With all of this blood, my non-white brothers dripping from your fangs, you have the damned audacity to ask me if I'm qualified? White man, listen to me, for I am talking to you. I am a man of principles and values, principles of justice and national liberation, self-determination and respect for national sovereignty. Yet you ask me if I'm physically fit to go to Asia, Africa, and Latin America to fight my oppressed brothers who are completely and resolutely within their just rights to free their fatherland from foreign domination. You ask me if I'm qualified to join an army of fools, assassins, and moral delinquents who are not worthy of being called men. You want me to defend the riches reaped from the super exploitation of the darker races of mankind by a few white, rich super monopolists who control the most vast empire that has ever existed in man's 1 million years of history, all in the name of freedom? Why, here in the heart of America, 22 million black people are suffering unsurmounted toil, exploited economically by every form of business, from monopolists to petty hustlers, completely suppressed politically, deprived of their social and cultural heritage. But all men of principle are fighting men. My fight is for freedom, Uhuru, Libertad, Aluga, and Harambe. Therefore, when the call is made to free South Africa, when the call is made to liberate Latin America from United Fruit Company, Kaiser, and Alcoa Aluminum Company, and from Standard Oil, when the call is made to jail the exploiting Brahmins in India in order to destroy the caste system, when the call is made to free the Black Delta areas of Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, when the call is made to free Harlem, New York, to free 12th Street here in Detroit, and all the other 12th streets around the country. Yes, when these calls are made, send for me. For these shall be historic struggles in which it shall be an everlasting honor and pleasure for me to serve. Vencer Ramos, General Gordon Baker. Thank you all.